Let's set the scene. It's December of 1988 in Ohio. On a brutally cold winter night, Sarah Mitchell vanished from inside her own home, leaving behind a scene of bloodshed chaos and a town whose sense of security was shattered forever. But this is where the story takes a hard left turn 36 years later. A shocking breakthrough nobody could have predicted would crack the case wide open, revealing the monster responsible had been hiding in plain sight, living right next door the whole time. Hey, before we get into the chilling details of this story, do me a favor and drop a 1 in the comments if you're as hooked on the true crime genre as I am. I really want to know you're here, because these stories are more than just entertainment. They demand to be told. These aren't just case files. They're about real people, real families that were ripped apart, and entire communities forced to live in fear for decades. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button for more stories that will haunt you, and smash that like button if you're ready to take a deep dive into one of Ohio's most disturbing cold cases that finally saw justice served. While certain details have been dramatized and names altered to protect the privacy of those involved, this account is rooted in the real events that sent shockwaves through a small town, leaving behind wounds that have yet to completely heal. In December of 1988, Sarah Mitchell was 58 years old, and if you'd asked anyone in the small Ohio town of Lorain, they would have told you she was one of the truly good people. She wasn't flashy, didn't crave the spotlight, or invite drama. She was just a solid, decent woman who showed up for her shift at the factory every morning, kept her home as neat as a pin, and lived a life of quiet dignity. Divorced for years, she wasn't lonely. She had her routines, her work friends, and a small circle of neighbors who still looked out for one another the way people did before the world got so disconnected. The factory where Sarah earned her living was anything but glamorous. It was one of those sprawling industrial plants that were the lifeblood of small Midwestern towns, back then all concrete and steel, filled with the constant thrum of machinery that eventually just faded into the background. Sarah had been a fixture there for over 2 decades, the kind of employee every supervisor dreams of, always punctual, never a word of complaint, just did her job, and did it right. Her colleagues respected her. She wasn't one to get tangled up in break-room gossip. She'd simply eat the lunch she packed, make small talk about the weather, and then get right back to the line. Her home was on a quiet street where everybody knew your name, or so they believed. It was a neighborhood of modest ranch houses with tidy yards, the kind of place where the Saturday morning air hummed with lawnmowers and folks waved as they rolled their trash cans to the curb. Sarah's house was immaculate, a clear source of pride. You could see it in the flower beds that bloomed in the summer and the perfectly shoveled walkway in the winter. It was her haven, her sanctuary from the noise and grind of the factory floor. December 19th, 1988, began as just another Monday for Sarah. She was up before the sun, likely brewing a pot of coffee in the quiet dark, getting ready for work. The forecast was calling for a bitter cold, the kind that was typical for an Ohio December. She bundled up, locked her front door, and made her way to the factory. It was just another day, another shift. She had no way of knowing it would be her last. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at work that day. Sarah moved through her tasks, worked her stations, and exchanged the usual pleasantries. But this is where the timeline gets a little twisted and frankly sketchy as all hell. That afternoon, Sarah's old car refused to start, a common problem in the biting cold. She was stranded and needed a way home, and that's precisely when her neighbor Michael Douglas conveniently stepped into the frame. Michael was just 26 years old and lived right next door to Sarah. He was a young guy who seemed perfectly friendly, the type of neighbor who'd offer a wave, maybe help you with your groceries, or lend a hand with a snow-covered driveway. There was nothing about him that set off alarm bells, nothing that hinted at danger. He was just another face in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood. So when Sarah mentioned her car troubles, Michael offered to let her borrow his to get home. A nice gesture, right? Just neighbors helping neighbors. Sarah gratefully accepted his offer. She drove Michael's car home that evening, no doubt relieved to have dodged the hassle of a dead battery and an expensive tow truck in the freezing temperatures. She pulled into her own driveway as the early winter darkness descended. She walked into her house, her thoughts likely turning to dinner, a little TV, and the simple comfort of being home after a long day. She was completely unaware that someone was watching her, someone with a plan that was about to turn her quiet Monday night into an absolute nightmare. What unfolded next inside Sarah Mitchell's home was an act of pure savagery. It was a level of brutality that sickens you to your core, the kind your mind struggles to even comprehend. An intruder forced their way into her house, or maybe they didn't have to. Maybe she simply opened the door to a familiar face, to someone she thought she could trust. The scene that was eventually uncovered told a horrifying story of a woman fighting for her very life against an attacker who showed absolutely no mercy. Her home was completely ransacked. Furniture was toppled. Belongings were scattered everywhere, the unmistakable signs of a violent, desperate struggle. Sarah did not give up without a fight. She fought with everything she had, but her assailant was younger, stronger, and fueled by something truly dark and depraved. The level of violence was extreme, almost personal. This was no simple burglary gone bad. This was pure, unadulterated rage. And then there was only silence. Sarah Mitchell was gone, taken in the one place she should have been safest. The deep December cold seeped through the walls as the night wore on. Outside, the neighborhood was still. It was peaceful. No one heard a thing. No one saw a thing. No one had any idea that just feet away, a woman had been viciously ended in cold blood. 48 hours went by. For 2 entire days, Sarah's body lay undiscovered as the world outside her door continued on. Her supervisor at the factory called when she didn't show up for her shift, highly unusual for someone as reliable as Sarah. Her friends tried her phone. No answer. It was so unlike her not to call in, not to let someone know. They could feel it in their bones. Something was terribly wrong. One of Sarah's closest work friends just couldn't shake the awful feeling. It was that gut instinct telling her something was seriously, horribly off. On December 21st, she drove over to Sarah's house to check on her. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She pounded again, her calls echoing into the silence. Her worry quickly spiraled into full-blown fear. She picked up the phone and called the police. When officers arrived and made entry into the home, they walked into a scene of unimaginable horror. They found Sarah Mitchell's body, amidst the evidence of a brutal, violent struggle. The house in total chaos. This was no accident. No death by natural causes. This was a calculated, vicious murder. The property was immediately sealed off as a crime scene detectives were called in, and the slow, heavy wheels of justice began to turn. Drop a comment, and let me know what state you're watching from, because this kind of nightmare isn't just an Ohio story. Small-town evil, where neighbors become predators, it can happen anywhere. We all want to believe we're safe in our own neighborhoods, but the chilling truth is, sometimes the monster is living right next door. The initial investigation launched into high gear immediately. Detectives meticulously processed the scene, documenting every last detail, the blood spatter, patterns, any signs of a forced entry, or the lack thereof, the condition of the body, the state of the home. They began interviewing neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who knew Sarah, or might have noticed anything unusual around December 19th. The neighborhood was reeling in absolute shock. Sarah Mitchell, murdered. On this quiet street, where the biggest news was usually a stray dog, people started double-checking their locks. Parents held their children a little closer. The comforting illusion of safety that had defined their community had been shattered in an instant. If this could happen to Sarah in her own home, then no one was truly safe. Detectives ran down every single lead, no matter how small. Could it have been a burglary? It didn't fit. Nothing of value seemed to be missing, and the violence was far too personal, far too extreme. Was it a ghost from her past? Maybe an ex-husband. They looked into it, but he had a solid alibi and no clear motive. What about her co-workers? Any grudges at the factory? None that would escalate to this, a random attack. It was possible, but less likely in a small town where a stranger would stick out like a sore thumb. And then investigators circled back to a key detail from that day. Sarah's car had died at the factory. She had borrowed someone else's to get home. But who's Michael Douglas, the young guy who lived right next door? Detectives decided it was time to have a long talk with Michael. Initially, Michael played it cool and cooperative. Sure, he'd lent Sarah his car. He was just being a good neighbor, helping her out of a jam. Nothing weird about it. But the detectives felt that nagging instinct, that gut feeling cops get when a story doesn't sit right. They asked if they could take a quick look around his place. Just routine, they said, to officially clear him. Michael agreed. Maybe he was trying to seem helpful, or maybe he just thought he was smart enough to get away with it. What the detectives discovered inside Michael Douglas's home sent a chill down their spines. They found a single shoe, and on it, what looked like a blood stain. Forensic tests would later confirm it was Sarah's blood. And that wasn't the only thing. They also found personal items belonging to Sarah, things that had absolutely no reason to be in Michael's house, unless he had taken them from hers. The pieces of the puzzle began snapping into place, and the image they created was utterly horrifying. Michael Douglas, the helpful neighbor, had likely used his act of kindness as a Trojan horse. Maybe he'd stopped by that evening to get his car back, and she'd let him in without a second thought. Why wouldn't she? He was her neighbor, a seemingly nice young man, or perhaps he'd made a copy of her key. But however he got inside, what he did next was monstrous. Detectives hauled Michael in for an official interrogation. They laid out the evidence they had the shoe, with Sarah's blood, her personal belongings in his home, the simple facts of his proximity and opportunity. Michael immediately asked for a lawyer. But here was the problem. This was 1988. DNA testing was in its infancy, barely a tool in the arsenal of criminal justice. The science was there, but it wasn't the refined, bulletproof evidence it is today. What they had was a mountain of circumstantial evidence. It was suspicious as hell, but was it enough to stand up in court? The prosecutors reviewed the case file. They had physical evidence that tied Michael to the scene, but the DNA technology of the era couldn't prove it was Sarah's blood on that shoe, with the 100% certainty a jury would need for a murder conviction. Without a confession, without a single eyewitness, without that undeniable smoking gun, they feared they would lose the case at trial. And in our justice system, you only get one chance. If Michael Douglas was found not guilty, he could never be charged with Sarah's murder again, no matter what new evidence might surface down the road. The decision was made, and it's one that has haunted everyone involved ever since. They concluded they just didn't have enough to guarantee a conviction. They let Michael Douglas walk free. No arrest was made, no charges were filed. All that was left was a cloud of suspicion, a deep sense of frustration, and the case of a murdered woman officially going cold. The community was furious. Sarah's friends from the factory were in disbelief. Her family was completely shattered. In their hearts, everyone felt they knew who did it, but knowing something and proving it beyond a reasonable doubt are two very different things. For a while, Michael continued to live in his house right next door to the home where he had almost certainly taken Sarah Mitchell's life. Can you even imagine that? The sheer audacity, the ice in his veins, to walk past that house every single day, knowing what he had done inside. Eventually, Michael Douglas moved away. Life on the surface returned to normal, but for Sarah's family and friends, there was no justice, no closure. Her case file was packed up and stored away in a police department archive. The years bled into decades. The 1990s came and went, and a new millennium began. Technology leapt forward, the world transformed. But Sarah Mitchell's murder remained unsolved, and her killer remained free. Her family never ever gave up hope, and that's the heartbreaking reality for the families of victims they can never truly forget, never completely move on. They're forced to live with this gaping wound in their lives, a constant ache of absence and injustice. Every single birthday Sarah missed, every holiday, every life milestone, it was all overshadowed by the brutal weight of her murder and the sickening knowledge that her killer was still out there. Let me know in the comments what case you want me to cover next, because stories like Sarah's have to be told. These victims deserve to be remembered, and their stories deserve to be heard until justice is found. The original detectives on Sarah's case in 1988 eventually moved on to other investigations, but some of them could never shake this one. That's the thing about cold cases. They get under your skin, they haunt you. The ones that slip away, the ones where you're sure you know who did it, but just can't make it stick. Those are the ones that eat you alive over the years. Some of those cops went into retirement with Sarah Mitchell's face still in their minds, forever frustrated by the justice that slipped right through their fingers. But here's the incredible thing about cold cases in the modern age. They don't always stay cold. Technology is always pushing forward. The DNA testing that was so primitive and limited back in 1988 was standard practice by the 2000s. And then it got even more powerful, more sophisticated, able to pull a genetic fingerprint from the tiniest, oldest, most degraded samples. What was scientifically impossible in 1988 became routine by 2020. All across America, police departments began dusting off their old cold case files, pulling evidence bags from deep storage that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. They started running new tests with this game-changing technology, and suddenly they were solving murders that everyone had written off as unsolvable, finally bringing justice to families who had long since given up hope. And back in Ohio, the department that handled Sarah Mitchell's murder had never fully closed the book on it. As new detectives came on board, they'd hear the story, they'd pull the old files, and the evidence was still there, perfectly preserved, just waiting. Then in 2024, a staggering 36 years after Sarah was killed, someone made the call to take another shot. "Let's run the DNA again," they said. "With everything we've got now, let's see what we find." The samples were shipped off to the lab. Cutting-edge DNA analysis was used on evidence gathered back when forensic science was in its infancy, and the results came back crystal clear, definitive, and absolutely undeniable. That blood found on the shoe in Michael Douglas's house back in 1988, it was Sarah Mitchell's. No question, no ambiguity. The DNA match was a lock, but it was more than just the shoe. Investigators re-examined every single piece of evidence collected from Michael's house all those years ago, other items, other samples, and every single thing pointed in one damning direction. Michael Douglas was the one who ended Sarah Mitchell's life. They had suspected it in 1988, but they couldn't prove it. Now they finally could. The wheels of justice began to grind back into motion. A new team of prosecutors reviewed the case, collaborating with the detectives to build an ironclad set of charges that would hold up in court. The evidence was finally there, stronger than ever, backed by science that was impossible to argue with. They drew up a warrant for the arrest of Michael Douglas. But where was Michael Douglas now? 36 years is a long time. He wasn't the 26-year-old man he used to be. Investigators tracked him to a new address in North Ridgeville, Ohio. He was 62 years old, living the life Sarah Mitchell was never given a chance to live. He'd gotten older, changed his address, and seemingly moved on. But had he really? Did he ever think about Sarah? Did he truly believe he'd gotten away with it? Did he sleep soundly at night? Or was he haunted by the face of the woman he'd killed? Then in 2024, police officers knocked on Michael Douglas's door. Can you even imagine the look on his face when he saw them, when they informed him he was under arrest for the 1988 murder of Sarah Mitchell? For 36 years he had walked as a free man, 36 years of living with his dark secret, and in that instant, it was all over. The past had finally come for him. Let me know in the comments if you believe justice was finally served, because this is the result when dedicated detectives refuse to give up, when science catches up to the crime, and when the truth claws its way into the light, no matter how long it's been buried. Michael Douglas was arrested and formally charged with murder. The mountain of evidence was presented to a grand jury, which promptly handed down an indictment. The case that had gone ice cold in 1988 was suddenly blazing hot again, splashing across the front pages of newspapers all over Ohio. The same community that had been gripped by fear and frustration decades earlier now watched, captivated as the legal system finally took its course. The trial was nothing short of intense. Prosecutors painstakingly reconstructed the timeline from December 19, 1988. They detailed how Sarah's car had stalled, how Michael had offered her a ride, creating the perfect trap. They argued how he likely went to her home later that night, either let in willingly or forcing his way in. They described the brutal personal nature of the violence that ensued, and they presented the smoking gun evidence from his house in 1988, now irrefutably linked to Sarah through modern DNA. The defense attorneys did their best to poke holes in the case, questioning the age of the evidence, the decades that had passed, and the reliability of DNA from samples collected 36 years prior. But the science was unshakable. The evidence was crystal clear, and the jury simply wasn't buying what the defense was selling. Michael Douglas was found guilty of the murder of Sarah Mitchell. The moment the verdict was read, the courtroom exploded with emotion. Members of Sarah's family, some of whom had waited over 3 long decades for this day, collapsed in tears. At long last, there was justice. It couldn't bring Sarah back, nothing ever could, but it meant everything. It meant the man responsible for stealing her future, would finally be held accountable. Next came the sentencing. The judge stared down Michael Douglas, now a 62-year-old man who had enjoyed 36 years of freedom he never deserved, years he had brutally stolen from Sarah Mitchell. The sentence was delivered without hesitation, life in prison, with no possibility of parole. Michael Douglas would spend the rest of his days behind bars, which is precisely where he belonged. For Sarah's family and friends, the moment was completely overwhelming. It was a tidal wave of conflicting emotions, joy tangled with grief, profound relief mixed with the sharp pain of all the lost years. They had never stopped fighting for her, never given up hope that one day justice would prevail. And now, after so long, it had finally arrived late, but undeniably real. The original lead detective from 1988, long since retired, made a point to be at the trial. He sat quietly in the courtroom watching as the guilty verdict was read, watching as Michael Douglas was finally led away in handcuffs. This was the case that had haunted his entire career, the one that always felt like it got away. But in the end, it hadn't. It's a powerful reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sarah Mitchell's story serves as a vital reminder that cold cases are never truly hopeless. Technology evolves, new information can surface, and dedicated investigators will never stop seeking the truth. And the families who never stop pushing, who keep their loved one's name alive and refuse to let them be forgotten. They make all the difference. Every cold case is a story of a stolen life, a shattered family, and a wounded community. And every single one that gets solved is a beacon of hope, a moment of closure, and a testament to justice. The factory where Sarah once worked is long gone shuttered, like so many others across the Rust Belt. The neighborhood she called home has changed, with new families replacing the old. But the people who actually knew Sarah, who remember her quiet strength and her kind heart, they've never forgotten. To them, she's not just a headline or a victim. She's a real person they miss. A good woman who deserved so much more, who deserved to live a long, peaceful life. The conviction of Michael Douglas sent shockwaves through the news, not just in Ohio, but nationwide. It became a textbook example of how DNA technology is completely changing the game for criminal justice, cracking open murders that have been cold for decades and giving closure to families on the brink of despair. You can bet that cold case units everywhere were paying attention. If Sarah Mitchell's killer could be brought to justice after 36 years, what other impossible cases were now suddenly possible? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more stories where justice against all odds finally wins. Because there are so many more cases out there, just like Sarah's cases, that have been cold for years but are far from forgotten and far from hopeless. That Ohio courthouse has seen thousands of trials over its history, but the case of Sarah Mitchell was different. The sheer amount of time that had passed, the relentless persistence of investigators, and the incredible power of science all converged in that one courtroom. The prosecutors involved called it one of the most deeply satisfying verdicts of their entire careers, not because of any sensational details, but because for so long, justice had felt completely out of reach. As Michael Douglas was led from the courtroom to begin his life sentence, you could feel a mix of emotions in the air. For some, there was a quiet sense of closure. For others, there was a burning rage for the decades he'd stolen, not just from Sarah, but from a family forced to live without answers. And both reactions are completely valid. There's no instruction manual for how to feel when the person who took your loved one away 36 years ago is finally facing the music. Outside the courthouse, Sarah's surviving family members spoke with reporters. They described the agony of living every day, knowing her killer was walking free. They spoke of the empty chair at every Christmas and Thanksgiving, a painful silent reminder of their loss. They explained how they tried to move on, but that true healing was impossible as long as justice was denied. One of her relatives said something that resonated with everyone there. Sarah was so much more than a victim. She was our sister, our friend. She was family. She worked hard, lived a simple life, and never hurt a soul. And someone stole all of that from her for no reason other than the darkness inside of them. Today, that darkness finally has to answer for what it did. Back in the small Ohio town where it all happened, the news was processed in different ways. The older folks who remembered the murder, who lived through the fear and suspicion of that time, felt a sense of vindication. Many had always felt that something was off about Michael Douglas. For the younger residents, it was a sudden chilling history lesson about a tragedy that had left an invisible scar on their town. And what about Michael Douglas himself? Throughout the entire trial and sentencing, he showed absolutely no emotion. No remorse, no apology, nothing. He just sat there, stone-faced as the evidence piled up, as witnesses took the stand, and as the jury sealed his fate. Maybe after 36 years, he'd convinced himself he was untouchable. Or maybe he was simply a cold, empty shell of a man incapable of ever facing the horror of what he had done. The prosecutors who finally put him away weren't concerned with his feelings. Their only job was to get justice, and they had delivered. Once modern DNA testing entered the picture, the evidence was an open and shut case. Michael Douglas had left a trail of his crime everywhere on his shoe, inside his own home, and all over Sarah's. Back in 1988, the technology just wasn't there to say what those traces truly meant. But in 2024, there was no room left for doubt. Drop a 2 in the comments if you saw that twist coming, because sometimes the answers are staring us in the face. But it takes time and technology to bring them into focus. The forensic scientists who ran the DNA tests that finally put Michael Douglas away spoke about how much the game had changed. Back in 1988, DNA testing needed big samples and still left a shadow of a doubt. By 2024, they could pull a complete profile from a microscopic trace, even from a degraded sample, and deliver results with near-perfect certainty. The very same evidence that couldn't seal the deal in 1988 became an unbreakable chain in 2024. This leap in forensic science has shockwaves that go far beyond Sarah Mitchell's case. All across the country, thousands of cold cases are just sitting in evidence lockers waiting for a fresh set of eyes and a new piece of tech. Murders from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s cases that seemed impossible to solve back then are now being cracked wide open. Families who had long since given up hope are getting calls from detectives saying, "We have new results. We have a name. We're going after him." For the detectives who originally worked Sarah's case in 1988, watching Michael Douglas finally get convicted was a bittersweet victory. They knew it was him back then. They had their man, but couldn't make the charges stick. All those years of frustration of knowing a monster was walking free of watching Sarah's family live without closure that never went away. The conviction didn't erase the past, but it proved them right. They'd been on the money all along. They just didn't have the tools to prove it. One of the retired detectives from the original investigation told a reporter after the conviction, "We never forgot Sarah, not for a day. We never forgot what he did to her. And to be honest, we never thought we'd see justice in our lifetime. But here we are. The tech finally caught up. Sarah's family has their answer. And Michael Douglas is right where he belongs, behind bars for the rest of his life." The evidence laid out at trial painted a chilling picture of that December night in 1988. Michael Douglas, young and arrogant, likely thought he was untouchable when he loaned Sarah his car. Maybe he'd been planning it for a while, or maybe it was a dark impulse. Either way, when he showed up at Sarah's house that night, whether she invited him in or he forced his way through the door, he brought pure evil with him. The medical examiner's testimony was graphic, detailing the brutal injuries Sarah had endured. The defense tried to shut it down, arguing the details were too inflammatory, too prejudicial, but the judge overruled them. The jury had to understand exactly what Michael Douglas was capable of. They needed to see the full horrific scope of his crime. Sarah Mitchell didn't go quietly. She fought for her life, and Michael Douglas showed her zero mercy. The physical evidence told its own silent story. The chaos in Sarah's house, the clear signs of a struggle, the way her body was found, all of it was meticulously documented in 1988 and presented to the jury in 2024. Crime scene photos that had collected dust in a file for 36 years suddenly became the prosecution's most powerful exhibits. Every single detail mattered, and every piece of evidence made the case against him stronger. Michael Douglas's defense team gave it their best shot. They tried to cast doubt on the reliability of DNA evidence from samples that were so old. They floated the idea that contamination could have happened over 3 decades in storage. They argued that forensic protocols were completely different back in 1988. But the prosecution saw every one of these arguments coming and had a counter for each. The lab that handled the new DNA testing followed the strictest protocols imaginable. The evidence had been perfectly preserved and handled with extreme care. The chain of custody was airtight. They ran multiple tests to confirm the results. Independent experts even verified the findings. There was no contamination, no mistake, no room for doubt. The DNA on that shoe belonged to Sarah Mitchell, and that shoe was found in Michael Douglas's house in 1988. The science was undeniable. Smash that like button if this story has you on the edge of your seat, because we are far from finished. There's still so much more to uncover about how this case went from ice cold to a closed-book conviction. The prosecution also wove a compelling story from circumstantial evidence. Michael Douglas's behavior in the aftermath of the murder was a sea of red flags. He was twitchy and evasive when detectives questioned him back in 1988. He packed up and moved out of the neighborhood shortly after, even though he'd lived there for years. People who knew him back then said he changed after Sarah's death. He became more withdrawn, almost paranoid. On its own, none of it was a smoking gun, but when you added it to the physical evidence, the picture became crystal clear. The jury was out for less than a single day. When they filed back in with a guilty verdict, Sarah's family just broke down, a wave of relief and grief crashing over them at once. 36 years of waiting, of hoping, of wondering if this day would ever come, it all came to a head in that one moment. They embraced, cried without shame, and thanked the prosecutors and detectives who refused to let Sarah become just another forgotten name in a file. The look on Michael Douglas's face when the verdict was read is something no one in that courtroom will ever forget. There was no emotion, no flicker of reaction, just a cold, blank stare. Maybe he'd seen it coming. Maybe he'd spent the entire trial running the odds and knew his time was up. Or maybe after living with his dark secret for so long, he just didn't care anymore. At the sentencing hearing, a few weeks later, Sarah's family finally got their chance to speak. Victim impact statements are always powerful, but when the victim has been gone for 36 years, when a family has carried that gaping wound for decades, their words carry an incredible weight. Sarah's sister, now in her 80s, stood before the judge and spoke of growing up with Sarah, of the future they'd planned, and of how one man's senseless violence had ripped it all away. Even Sarah's old co-workers sent in statements. They remembered her as kind and hard-working, someone who wouldn't harm a fly. They talked about the fear that swept through the factory after she was taken, how colleagues started looking at each other differently, how trust became a little harder to find. The ripples of a violent crime spread far beyond the victim. They poison families, friendships, and entire communities, leaving scars that can take generations to fade. The judge took it all in before handing down the sentence life, without the possibility of parole. No do-overs, no getting out early for good behavior. Michael Douglas would die in prison, a fate most agreed was exactly what he deserved. Some had called for the ultimate price, but others argued that a lifetime behind bars meant he'd have decades to sit and think about what he did, forced to live with his crime every single day. After the sentencing, Sarah's family held a small memorial. It wasn't a funeral. That had happened 36 years ago. This was different. This was a final, quiet acknowledgement that their long, painful fight for justice was over. They gathered at her gravesite, laid down flowers, and shared old memories. Someone brought a picture of Sarah from before it all happened, smiling full of life. That's how they chose to remember her, not as a statistic, but as a vibrant person who lived and loved and mattered. The media frenzy around Michael Douglas's conviction ignited a national conversation about cold cases. How many other killers were out there living normal lives, thinking they'd gotten away with it? How many other families were still trapped in a nightmare of not knowing? Victims' advocacy groups held up Sarah's case as a prime example of why cold case units desperately need funding, why evidence must be meticulously preserved, and why you can never ever give up the search for justice. Let me know in the comments if you've ever heard of this case, because stories like Sarah's are more common than you think, and every single victim deserves to have their story told and their case solved. Police departments in other states started digging into their own cold case files with a new sense of purpose. If a 36-year-old murder could be solved in Ohio, then maybe they could do it too. Evidence rooms were turned upside down. Dusty old case files were pulled from shelves. Veteran detectives sat down with younger officers, poring over unsolved homicides and flagging the ones that could get a second life from new DNA testing or other modern forensic tools. The lab that cracked Sarah's case saw a massive spike in requests. Other departments were sending in old evidence, hoping that modern science could find the answers that 1980s technology had missed. The waiting list grew longer, but so did the feeling of hope. Every single cold case that gets solved is another family that finds peace, another killer brought to justice, and another community that can finally begin to heal. For the Ohio community, where Sarah lived and was so brutally taken, Michael Douglas's conviction felt like closing a dark chapter. The neighborhood had changed completely since 1988. New homes, new families, new everything. But the old-timers remembered Sarah. They remembered the terror that gripped them after her murder, and they remembered the bitter sting of betrayal when Michael Douglas walked free. Now, at long last, they could close that chapter, knowing justice had finally been served. Sarah's house was sold off years ago and has had several owners since. The people living there today probably have no idea about its history, no clue that a horrific crime took place inside those very walls decades ago. And maybe that's for the best. A house is just 4 walls, and a roof it doesn't hold on to guilt or innocence. It's the people inside that define it. Michael Douglas's old house next door also has new owners. Someone bought it years back, raised their kids there, and likely never knew that the man who used to live there once loaned his car to a neighbor, and then took her life. The neighborhood moved on the way they always do. Life went on. But the memory of what happened and the weight of that history never truly left the minds of those who lived through it. The legal system that failed Sarah in 1988 learned a hard lesson from her case. Prosecutors became more determined to push for DNA testing even when the technology was in its infancy. Defense attorneys learned to be more mindful of how evidence could be preserved for future analysis. And judges started thinking twice before dismissing cases that seemed weak at the time, but might just be a scientific breakthrough away from being solved. There's a powerful lesson in Sarah Mitchell's story about the virtues of patience and persistence. Her family could have given up hope. They could have resigned themselves to the fact that justice was out of reach, that Michael Douglas would get away with it. But they refused. They kept Sarah's memory burning bright. They constantly checked in with the police, asking for updates and pushing them to take another look. Their refusal to give up ensured that when the technology was finally ready, her case was too. Share this video with a fellow true crime fan because these stories are more than just entertainment. They're a powerful reminder that justice is always possible, even if it takes a lifetime to find. The detective who finally put the pieces of Sarah's case together in 2024 wasn't even alive when she was taken. He came to the cold case unit with fresh energy, eager to look at old files with a new perspective. When he opened Sarah's file, something about it just stuck with him. Maybe it was the fact that they had an obvious suspect who was never charged. Maybe it was the family's relentless calls over the years, or maybe it was just a gut feeling. Whatever the reason, he made the call to push for new DNA testing, and that one decision changed absolutely everything. The detective submitted the evidence, stayed in constant contact with the lab, and managed the process every step of the way. When the results came back as a positive match, definitively tying Michael Douglas to Sarah's murder, he knew this was huge. This wasn't just about closing a cold case. This was about giving a family an answer after 36 long years of unbearable pain. The arrest of Michael Douglas in 2024 was nothing like what you see in the movies. There was no high-speed chase, no tense standoff, not a hint of resistance. The police just knocked on his door, informed him he was under arrest, and he complied without a word. You have to wonder if he'd been waiting for that knock for years. Maybe he'd seen the news, seen how new DNA tech was closing old cases, and just knew his time was coming. Or maybe he'd so thoroughly convinced himself he'd gotten away with it that the handcuffs felt like a complete and utter shock. After his arrest, the booking photo of a 62-year-old Michael Douglas went viral. News outlets splashed it right next to a picture of him from 1988, a 26-year-old man who was just a person of interest back then. The difference was jarring. Time had etched new lines on his face and grayed his hair, but it couldn't erase what he'd done. The young man who took Sarah Mitchell's life was still in there, buried under the years, but just as responsible and just as guilty. The public's reaction to the arrest was a tidal wave of support for the prosecution. Social media exploded with comments praising the cold case detectives, thanking the lab techs, and pouring out sympathy for Sarah's long-suffering family. Sure, a few dissenting voices questioned the point of prosecuting a crime from 36 years ago, but they were quickly drowned out by a chorus of people who believed that for true justice, there is no statute of limitations. Preparing for the trial was a months-long battle. Prosecutors knew their DNA evidence was rock solid, but they also knew the defense would come at them from every angle. They would challenge the age of the evidence, the way it was stored, the testing protocols. Every single detail would be put under a microscope. So they marshaled their forces. They brought in top expert witnesses, created detailed presentations to break down the complex DNA science for the jury, and pieced together a timeline so tight it left no room for doubt. From the very beginning, the defense attorneys were facing a nearly impossible climb. The DNA evidence was absolutely devastating, and they knew it. Their only play was to create chaos, to cast doubt on the procedures, to question the reliability of testing samples that were decades old, to float the idea of contamination. It was a flimsy strategy, but it was the only one they had. All the while, Michael Douglas officially maintained his innocence, though he never once took the stand to tell his version of the story. The trial itself became a media circus, captivating audiences in Ohio and far beyond. Local news channels provided wall-to-wall coverage, tracking down Sarah's old co-workers, interviewing neighbors who remembered the fear in 1988, and getting commentary from legal experts on the precedent this case was setting. It wasn't long before national true crime shows picked up the story, completely fascinated by the 3-decade-long chasm between the crime and the final dramatic reckoning. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Sarah's family occupied the front row every single day, their presence a silent, powerful reminder of what this was all about. Not slick legal maneuvers or complex forensic science, but a young woman whose life was stolen and a family who had endured 36 years of unanswered questions. They watched every witness hung on every word of testimony and waited for the one moment they had been praying for since 1988, the verdict. The prosecution's case was methodical, deliberate, and devastating. They began not with the crime, but with Sarah's life, carefully painting a portrait of the woman she was before she became a statistic. The factory workers she'd shared a shift with took the stand, speaking of her character, her dependability, her quiet kindness. They made it clear to the jury that Sarah was a real person, with a real life, not just a name on a cold case file. This was never an abstract legal exercise. This was about getting justice for Sarah Mitchell. Then they took the jury back to December 19th, 1988. They reconstructed that fateful day hour by hour. Sarah at her job, her car giving out, and Michael Douglas stepping in to offer his own vehicle as a loan. The prosecution laid out their theory. This was the moment he saw his chance, the moment the dark plan began to form. Maybe he'd been fantasizing about his neighbor for a while, or maybe it was a sudden monstrous impulse. Whatever the case, when Sarah drove his car home that night, she was unknowingly driving into a trap that would cost her her life. The timeline marched forward, Sarah arriving home as the early evening darkness fell, the silent hours that followed when the unthinkable happened. The prosecution couldn't pinpoint the exact minute Michael went to her house. They couldn't offer a play-by-play, but the evidence screamed that he was there. His shoe stained with her blood told that story. The items from her home, found hidden in his, told that story, and the DNA clear and irrefutable told that story. The medical examiner's testimony was gut-wrenching. The details of Sarah's injuries, the sheer violence of the attack, the suffering she must have endured in her final moments. It was brutal, but it was necessary. The jury had to understand the cold hard reality of what Michael Douglas did. They needed to see past the sanitized legal jargon to the raw, unfiltered horror of the crime itself. Drop a comment below if you believe justice was finally served, because this is what happens when monsters think they've faded into the past. Sometimes it takes decades, but the truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. The presentation of the forensic evidence took several days. The prosecution brought in their top DNA experts, who patiently walked the jury through the evolution of the science from 1988 to 2024. They explained how samples that were once inconclusive could now yield a result with near-perfect certainty. They laid out the chain of custody, proving the evidence had been meticulously preserved. They presented the test results, the charts, and the hard data that all converged on a single inescapable conclusion. Michael Douglas's shoe was soaked in Sarah Mitchell's blood. The defense attorneys, cross-examined with everything they had, but they couldn't put a dent in the science. The experts were ready for every question, every challenge. Yes, the evidence was old, but it was stored by the book. No contamination was not a factor given the strict protocols. Yes, they ran the tests multiple times to confirm. No. There was a zero doubt about the DNA match. Every attack the defense launched simply fell apart. The prosecution didn't stop with the science. They also painted a picture of Michael Douglas's behavior right after the murder. They described how he'd been cagey and nervous when first questioned back in 1988. They brought up how neighbors saw him obsessively scrubbing his car in the days that followed Sarah's death. They pointed out how he suddenly moved out of the neighborhood despite having lived there for years. Taken alone, any one of these things might seem insignificant, but together they painted a clear picture of a guilty conscience. Character witnesses took the stand to speak for Sarah, to tell the jury about the person she was. Honest, hard-working, someone who never looked for trouble or got caught up in drama. The prosecution's message was crystal clear. Sarah wasn't the kind of person to invite violence into her world, as she was just an ordinary woman living an ordinary life until Michael Douglas made the decision to violently end it. The defense's case, when it finally came, was brief and utterly unpersuasive. Since they couldn't argue with the DNA, they tried to muddy the waters with confusion and doubt. They brought in their own expert who nitpicked testing procedures, but couldn't actually refute the findings. They threw out wild suggestions that maybe someone else had worn Michael's shoe, or that another person had planted Sarah's belongings in his house. It was a Hail Mary pass, and everyone in that courtroom knew it was falling incomplete. Michael Douglas made the choice not to testify. His lawyers almost certainly advised him against it. After all, what could he possibly say? Deny it all in the face of irrefutable DNA, try to spin some wild tale to explain away the bloody shoe and the stolen property. It was better to remain silent and hope the jury, by some miracle, would latch on to the defense's flimsy arguments. They didn't. The closing arguments tied it all together. The prosecutor stood before the jury and reminded them of Sarah Mitchell, the person, not just the name, see on the file. They walked through the evidence again, piece by damning piece, showing how every single thread led back to Michael Douglas. They systematically took apart the defense's attempts to create doubt, exposing each one for the distraction it was. And then they asked the jury to do what was impossible in 1988, to finally deliver justice for Sarah Mitchell. The defense's closing argument was one last desperate attempt to plant a seed of reasonable doubt. They hammered on the 36 years that had passed, suggesting memories fade and evidence degrades over time. They asked the jurors to question the fairness of convicting a man based on tests run so long after the fact, but you could tell their hearts weren't in it. They knew the fight was already over. The jury began its deliberations on a Thursday afternoon. 12 ordinary men and women filed into the deliberation room, armed with binders of evidence charts, timelines, and the crushing weight of a decision that would seal Michael Douglas's fate. In the courthouse hallway, Sarah's family held their breath, though caught between hope and 36 years of anxiety. By Friday morning, they had a verdict. Everyone shuffled back into the courtroom, the lawyers, Michael Douglas, Sarah's family, the reporters. The tension was so thick, you could feel it in the air. The judge turned to the jury foreperson and asked if they had reached a decision. "Yes, Your Honor, we have. On the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find the defendant?" "We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Douglas, guilty." The word guilty echoed through the courtroom, and the room just exploded. Sarah's family collapsed into tears, hugging one another, as decades of pain and bottled-up frustration finally came pouring out. The prosecutors allowed themselves a small satisfied smile. Through it all, Michael Douglas was a statue, showing no emotion, no reaction at all, just staring blankly ahead, as if none of it was real. The judge hammered the gavel, but it took several minutes for the wave of emotion to subside. Let me know in the comments which case you want me to uncover next, because for every story like Sarah's that gets told, there are so many others still waiting in the dark. After the verdict, the sheer gravity of it all began to sink in for everyone. For Sarah's family, it was a complex storm of emotions, joy tangled with grief relief, soured by the anger over all the stolen years. They had waited 36 years for this day, and now that it was here, it was almost too much to process. One family member told a reporter, "This doesn't bring Sarah back. Nothing ever will. But it's something. It means her life mattered. It means that justice is real." For the prosecution team, the conviction was a validation of years of relentless work, not just on this case, but on their entire cold case philosophy. They had just proven that murders decades old could still be solved, that scientific progress could finally deliver a justice that once seemed impossible. At the press conference following the verdict, they thanked the forensic lab, the tireless detectives who refused to give up, and Sarah's family for their incredible patience and faith. After the verdict came down, reporters tracked down the detectives who had worked the original investigation back in 1988. Most were retired, some were getting on in years, but every single one of them remembered the Sarah Mitchell case. They remembered the frustration of knowing who their suspect was but not being able to prove it. They remembered that bloody shoe and the stolen items found in Michael Douglas's house. Learning that he had finally, after all this time, been found guilty and brought to them a sense of closure they thought they would never get. A retired detective confessed, "In an interview, we knew back then. We knew Michael Douglas took Sarah's life. But there's a world of difference between knowing something and proving it. The technology just wasn't there. It gnawed at us for years, knowing he was walking around a free man. So to see justice finally delivered, even after 36 long years, that means everything." Sentencing was set for 3 weeks, following the verdict. In that time, Sarah's family painstakingly wrote their victim impact statements, carefully choosing the words they wanted to direct at Michael Douglas and the court. It was their one chance to bring Sarah back to life in that courtroom, to make everyone remember that behind all the legal jargon and forensic reports was a real person who had been violently ripped away from them. The sentencing hearing drew everyone back into the same courtroom. This time Michael Douglas was led in wearing a prison uniform, his days of sitting in a suit at the defense table long gone. He was now a convicted murderer, and he looked the part. Sarah's family took their usual seats, but a subtle change had come over them. They seemed lighter, as if an immense burden had been lifted, even as their grief remained. The judge then called for the victim impact statements. Sarah's sister, now 83 years old, was the first to speak, her voice trembling but filled with resolve. She spoke of growing up with Sarah, of the dreams they shared as children, and the unbreakable bond they had. She recounted the horror of December 1988, of receiving the call that Sarah was gone, and the utter devastation that shattered their world. "We lost Sarah twice," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "The first time was when Michael Douglas ended her life, and the second was when he walked free in 1988. For 36 years we've lived with the knowledge that he stole her from us and got away with it. But today, there are finally consequences. Today Sarah's life is finally honored. Today, justice feels real." Other family members shared their stories. Written statements from her old friends at the factory were read into the record. They painted a picture of Sarah's infectious laugh, her incredible work ethic, and her boundless kindness. They described the chilling atmosphere at the factory after her murder, the fear that took hold, and how the trust among them had been completely broken. They spoke of the agony of knowing her killer was out there somewhere free. The prosecution pushed for life, without parole. They laid out their case, the sheer brutality of the crime, the decades Michael Douglas spent in freedom, while Sarah's family agonized, and his complete and utter lack of remorse, all demanded the maximum sentence. They argued there was no scenario where he could be safely released, no amount of rehabilitation that could ever erase what he had done. The defense pleaded for a more lenient sentence, pointing out that Michael Douglas was now 62 years old and had lived a mostly unremarkable life in the intervening decades. It was a flimsy argument, and everyone in the room knew it. You don't get a pass for not taking more lives after you've already gotten away with one. Drop a comment and let us know which state you're watching from, because these heartbreaking stories unfold in communities everywhere, and every single one of them deserves justice. The judge paused, letting the weight of the moment settle in the room before he spoke. He reviewed the facts of the case, the evidence, the powerful testimony. He acknowledged the decades of pain Sarah's family had been forced to endure. Then he locked eyes with Michael Douglas and delivered the sentence, life in prison, without any possibility of parole. Michael Douglas would die behind bars, plain and simple. No hearings, no second chances, no hope of ever being free again. "Mr. Douglas," the judge stated, his voice firm, You extinguished Sarah Mitchell's life in a brutal and senseless act. You then stole 36 years of freedom you never deserved, while her family was left to suffer in a nightmare without answers. Modern science has finally unmasked your crime, and now you will face the absolute full consequences of your actions. You will spend the remainder of your days in prison, which is precisely where you belong. Michael Douglas was escorted out in handcuffs. He never once glanced at Sarah's family, his face a mask of indifference, not a single word passing his lips. Perhaps he had resigned himself to his fate, or maybe he was still lost in denial, or maybe he just didn't care. In the end, his state of mind was irrelevant. He was headed to prison for the rest of his natural life, and Sarah Mitchell's family finally had the justice they had fought for since 1988. After the sentencing, Sarah's family gathered at her grave once more. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The sadness was still there, an ache that would never fully fade, but it was mingled with a sense of relief, of hope. They had done it. Michael Douglas could never harm another soul. Sarah's memory had been vindicated. Justice had been served. The media frenzy that followed the sentencing shifted focus to the case's larger significance. It raised a critical question. How many other cold cases were just waiting to be solved by modern DNA technology? How many other families were still trapped in that same limbo of waiting victim advocacy groups seized on Sarah's story as a powerful example, demanding more funding for cold case units and stricter protocols for evidence preservation? Police departments all over the country were paying attention. Cold case detectives began dusting off old forgotten files, searching for cases with biological evidence that could be re-examined. Some agencies created dedicated cold case units for the very first time. Others beefed up their existing teams, bringing in more staff and forging stronger partnerships with forensic labs. Sarah Mitchell's case had become the new blueprint for tackling decades-old crimes. The forensic lab that had handled Sarah's evidence was suddenly slammed with requests. Other jurisdictions wanted their old evidence reanalyzed, hoping that today's technology could uncover truths that the tech of the 1980s or 1990s had missed. The lab expanded, hiring more specialists, investing in cutting-edge equipment, and creating new procedures for handling fragile aged evidence. They started closing cold cases at a rate no one had ever imagined possible. For the Ohio community where Sarah had lived and died, Michael Douglas's conviction finally closed a dark and painful chapter. The neighborhood was almost unrecognizable from how it was in 1988, filled with new families, new homes, and new stories. But the old-timers remembered, and for them seeing justice served after all this time was profoundly meaningful. The shadow that had hung over their town for so long had finally lifted. If this story has captivated you, hit that like button, because we're about to go even deeper into what a case like this means for victims' families everywhere. Sarah's case has also ignited a critical conversation about the justice system itself, particularly how it deals with cases where the evidence is strong, but maybe not a slam dunk at the time. Back in 1988, prosecutors made the agonizing choice not to charge Michael Douglas, fearing they might lose at trial with the limited DNA science of the era. It was a decision that would haunt them for years, even after justice was finally won. Legal experts fiercely debated whether the 1988 prosecutors made the right call. Some argued they should have rolled the dice and taken the case to trial, letting a jury decide, regardless of the weaker evidence, but others countered that an acquittal in 1988 would have meant Michael Douglas could never be tried for Sarah's murder again, no matter what new evidence surfaced. The principle of double jeopardy is absolute. You only get one shot. Looking back, the strategy to wait to carefully preserve the evidence and bet on future technology was undeniably the correct one. But that's easy to say 36 years later. In 1988, there was absolutely no guarantee that DNA testing would ever advance to this level. The prosecutors took a massive gamble by not charging him, and while it ultimately paid off, it could have just as easily ended in failure. This constant tension between moving on a suspect immediately and waiting for more definitive evidence is something cold case detectives and prosecutors wrestle with every single day. How long is too long to wait? When is the right moment to file charges? What if your suspect dies before the science catches up? There are no simple answers, and Sarah's case is a perfect illustration of both the incredible rewards and the immense risks of patience. The original detective on Sarah's case from 1988. A man still tormented by it decades later was asked in an interview if he believed they made the right choice back then. He paused for a long moment before he answered. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "A part of me will always think we should have charged him then and there, taken our shot. But another part of me knows that if we'd lost that trial in '88, Sarah's family would have never seen this day. So maybe waiting was the right thing to do. I just wish it hadn't taken so damn long." Sarah's family was asked that same question. Did they believe the 1988 prosecutors made the correct decision by not charging Michael Douglas? Their answers were mixed. Some wished charges had been brought right away, feeling that 36 years of uncertainty was too steep a price to pay. Others understood the strategic reasoning, grateful that patients ultimately secured a conviction that could never be overturned. But they all agreed on one thing: having Michael Douglas behind bars was what mattered most. The case also served as a stark reminder of the paramount importance of evidence preservation. In 1988, no one could have predicted that DNA science would evolve to a point where decades-old samples could be analyzed with such pinpoint accuracy. But that evidence was kept anyway, stored correctly, and maintained under conditions that made future testing possible. If that crucial step had been missed, Michael Douglas would likely still be a free man. This powerful lesson sent shockwaves through law enforcement, causing many departments to completely rethink their evidence storage policies. How long should evidence be kept? What are the best practices for preservation? How do you balance the reality of limited storage space with the potential need for evidence and decades down the road? Sarah's case provided a clear and undeniable answer. You keep everything for as long as you possibly can, because you never know when a technological breakthrough will change everything. Share this story with someone who is passionate about true crime, because these lessons in patience, persistence, and the long road to justice are what give hope to every unsolved case. The role Sarah's family played in keeping this case from going cold cannot be overstated. They never gave up, never stopped calling for updates, and never let the police department forget that Sarah's murder was still unsolved. They weren't overbearing or aggressive, but they were respectfully persistent in a way that ensured Sarah's file never got buried at the bottom of the pile. This kind of advocacy from a victim's family is absolutely essential in cold cases. Detectives are only human. They have limited time-tight budgets and a mountain of cases to work on. The cases that get consistent attention are often the ones where families refuse to be silent, where they apply gentle pressure to keep the investigation moving, and where the victim's name stays in the public consciousness. Sarah's family knew this instinctively, and they never wavered. They also became active in victim advocacy groups, forged bonds with the families of other murder victims, and educated themselves on the latest advances in forensic science. When new DNA testing methods emerged, they were the ones calling the police asking if Sarah's evidence could be re-examined. They weren't forensic experts, but they learned enough to ask the right questions and to effectively push for action. In 2024, the detective who finally got Sarah's evidence retested made one thing crystal clear. Her family's persistence was the driving force. They never let Sarah become just another file, he shared. Every few months a call or an email would come in, just checking, just hoping for an update. They were never demanding, but their message was unmistakable. They weren't going anywhere. That kind of dedication, it makes a detective want to move heaven and earth to find the answer. For other families trapped in the nightmare of an unsolved murder, Sarah's case became a beacon of hope. If justice could finally arrive after 36 long years, then maybe, just maybe, their own cases weren't lost causes. Perhaps their own relentless fight would eventually pay off. Perhaps science held the key to unlocking the answers they so desperately sought. Sarah Mitchell's story was now a powerful symbol for all those who had nearly given up. The prosecutors who finally put Michael Douglas away were showered with awards and praised by victim advocacy groups. They had courageously taken on a case that was decades old, navigating the immense challenges of aged evidence to deliver a just verdict. Yet in every interview they consistently shifted the spotlight to Sarah's family, to the original detectives who meticulously preserved the evidence, and to the brilliant forensic scientists who made the impossible possible. "We were just the ones standing in the right place at the right time with the right technology," one prosecutor stated. "The true heroes are Sarah's family, who held on to hope for 36 years, and the detectives who back in 1988 knew exactly who did this but just couldn't prove it. We simply finished the work they started. The forensic scientists who cracked the case were even more direct. "This is precisely why we do this work," one of them said. "Every cold case we help close, every family that finally gets a measure of peace, every monster who is finally held accountable, that's what gives this job its meaning." Sarah Mitchell's case is the perfect reminder of why pushing the boundaries of forensic science is so critical. Drop a comment below if you've heard about this case before, because once Michael Douglas was convicted, Sarah's story echoed across the country and around the world. The case also ignited fascinating legal debates about statutes of limitations and the ticking clock on justice. In most states, including Ohio, there is no time limit for prosecuting a murder, which is why Michael Douglas could be charged 36 years after the fact. But for other serious crimes, the clock does run out, meaning some cold cases can never be brought to trial, no matter how much new evidence comes to light. Legal experts held up Sarah's case as a prime example of why murder should never have an expiration date. Justice delayed is agonizing, but it is infinitely better than justice denied completely. If there had been a time limit on Sarah's case, Michael Douglas would have remained a free man, despite the irrefutable DNA evidence. The very idea of a killer walking away scot-free just because enough time went by feels fundamentally wrong to almost everyone. The trial also served as a stark illustration of how much criminal procedures have advanced since 1988. The protocols for evidence collection, DNA analysis, and maintaining the chain of custody have all become infinitely more rigorous and standardized, all to ensure that evidence holds up in court. The evidence from Sarah's case might not meet today's stringent standards, but it was handled well enough for its time, and ultimately, it was enough to put her killer behind bars. Defense attorneys who studied the trial took note of the very few moves they had left when confronted with such powerful DNA evidence. Michael Douglas's legal team tried every possible angle. They questioned the integrity of the decades-old evidence, hinted at possible contamination, and attacked the testing methods, but nothing stuck, because the science was just that solid. The case became a crucial lesson for defense lawyers on knowing when to advise a client to accept a plea deal instead of gambling on a trial. On the other side, Sarah's case was a masterclass for prosecutors on how to present incredibly complex scientific evidence to a jury of everyday people. The prosecution team worked for countless hours with their expert witnesses, designing presentations that explained DNA technology in a way that was clear and compelling without oversimplifying or losing scientific accuracy. They used diagrams, analogies, and a step-by-step approach that made the science totally accessible. Members of the jury, when interviewed after the verdict, confirmed that the prosecution's strategy was a home run. "We absolutely understood the DNA evidence," one juror commented. "They broke it down so well that we could follow the entire process and see exactly how it pointed to Michael Douglas. If they had just bombarded us with scientific terms, we would have been lost. But they didn't. They made sure we were with them every step of the way." Let me know in the comments if you believe justice was truly served, because Michael Douglas receiving a life sentence after 36 years of freedom sends a chilling message: you can run, but you can never truly escape your past. The maximum security prison in Ohio, where Michael Douglas will live out the rest of his days, is a world away from the life he knew. He'll spend his remaining years behind concrete and steel, likely for decades. The bitter irony is lost on no one. He was granted the freedom to live from age 26 to 62, while Sarah Mitchell was robbed of her life at 58. He got to grow old, to see the world change, to have decades that were stolen from Sarah. But at last, his final years will be spent in a cage, which is more justice than Sarah's family had for most of their lives. According to reports from inside the prison, Michael Douglas is a ghost. He keeps to himself, causes no problems, and follows every rule. He doesn't join any prison programs, refuses counseling, and shows no interest in educational courses. He just exists, a man, serving his time, never once speaking about his horrific crime. That complete lack of remorse, that silent refusal to acknowledge what he did, is a source of deep frustration for Sarah's family. But it doesn't surprise them. Some people are simply incapable of facing the monsters they are. Sarah's family now makes regular pilgrimages to her grave, especially on days that hold special meaning. Her birthday, the anniversary of her passing, and the anniversary of the day her killer was finally convicted. They bring flowers. They share stories they tell Sarah about their lives. In a strange way, having justice has finally given them permission to grieve fully, to finally process the raw emotions they had to suppress while fighting for a resolution. For 36 years, it felt like I couldn't truly mourn my sister. One family member shared. A part of me was always consumed by anger, always focused on the fight, always haunted by the image of Michael Douglas living free. Now that he's locked away, I can finally just miss Sarah, without that rage eating me alive. It doesn't take the pain away, but it has changed its shape. The factory where Sarah worked shut its doors in the early 2000s, another casualty of the industrial decline that swept through the Midwest. Her former co-workers, the ones who knew her well, had scattered to new jobs, new towns, and new lives. But when the news of Michael Douglas's conviction broke, many of them reconnected, calling each other to share the unbelievable update and to remember Sarah. Several even attended the trial, a quiet show of support for her family. Sarah was one of us, a former co-worker recalled. When she was taken from us, it sent a shockwave through the whole factory. We all felt unsafe, exposed. Knowing that her killer is finally paying for what he did brings a sense of closure, not just for her family, but for every single person who knew and cared about her. The neighborhood where Sarah lived and was brutally murdered is now completely unrecognizable. Very few of the original residents from 1988 still live there. The current homeowners are likely unaware of the dark history that unfolded on their street decades ago, that the seemingly helpful neighbor who ended Sarah Mitchell's life once lived right among them. The houses have been updated, repainted, and sold many times over. The physical landscape has changed, but for those who remember, the history remains. Type A2 in the comments if you saw that twist coming. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest danger lies behind the most normal, helpful, and ordinary facade. After Michael Douglas's conviction made national news, real estate agents in the area were flooded with questions. Are they legally required to disclose that a murder occurred in a house decades ago? The laws vary by state, but generally, after so much time has passed, it's not a mandatory disclosure. Still, some agents chose to be transparent, believing that potential buyers had a right to know the full history of a property. A family that had been living in Sarah's former home for several years was stunned to learn of its tragic past. They said they'd never felt anything strange or uncomfortable in the house. Discovering that someone had been killed inside their home was deeply unsettling, but they ultimately decided to stay. What happened to Sarah is heartbreaking, the current owner said, but that was a long time ago. It's not the house's fault. We've built our own happy memories here, and we're not going to let a dark past chase us away. Michael Douglas's former house right next door faced a more difficult fate. Some prospective buyers were immediately turned off, refusing to even consider a home where a murderer had lived. Others were more pragmatic, seeing it as just a building with a dark chapter in its past. It eventually sold to someone who wasn't bothered by the history, and the neighborhood moved on. The case continues to be a major topic of study in criminal justice programs, law schools, and forensic science courses across the country. It has become a textbook example of how a cold case can be resurrected by technology, of why meticulous evidence preservation is paramount, and how the sheer persistence of a family can change everything. Students now watch documentaries about the case, pore over trial transcripts, and analyze the very DNA evidence that finally brought Michael Douglas to justice. It didn't take long for the true crime documentary machine to spring into action. Within months of the conviction, productions were underway. Multiple companies were eager to tell Sarah's story, to showcase a tale where justice against all odds prevailed after decades. Her family was very selective, working only with producers who promised to portray Sarah with respect and keep the focus on the quest for justice, not on cheap sensationalism. One documentary that landed on a major streaming service became a definitive telling of the story. It featured emotional interviews with Sarah's family, the original detectives from 1988, the modern-day investigators, the prosecutors, and the forensic experts. It expertly guided viewers through the entire timeline, from Sarah's tragic death to Michael Douglas's conviction, breaking down the DNA science in a way everyone could understand and highlighting the powerful combination of persistence and technology. The documentary was a massive hit, trending on social media and sparking widespread conversations about cold cases and the power of forensic science. Viewers were floored by how long the case remained unsolved, but were deeply inspired by the fact that justice was finally delivered. Many commented that they had never heard of the case before, but were profoundly moved by Sarah's story and her family's unwavering dedication. Hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories like this one, because there are thousands of cold cases still out there, and every single victim deserves to have their story told and their killer brought to justice. In the wake of the conviction, other families of cold case victims began reaching out to Sarah's family, desperate for advice and a glimmer of hope. Sarah's sister found a new purpose, becoming an informal advocate for others. She shared the lessons she had learned about persistence, about keeping a case in the public eye, and about pushing authorities to re-examine evidence with new technology. She began speaking at conferences and joining support groups, helping other families navigate the agonizing wait for justice. If our family's story can help even one other family find justice, then all those years of pain and waiting will mean something more, she said. Sarah's legacy isn't just that her case was solved. It's about showing other families that they should never ever give up, that scientific breakthroughs can make a difference, and that justice is always possible, even when it feels completely hopeless. The detective who finally championed the re-examination of Sarah's evidence in 2024 channeled that victory into his relentless pursuit of other cold cases. Every cold case is a family frozen in time, in pain. He stated, "Each unsolved murder is an open wound that can't close without justice. Sarah Mitchell's case proved to me that no trail is too cold, no evidence too far gone. If we can crack a 36-year-old case, we can crack others." I'm just getting started. The forensic lab that cracked Sarah's case was catapulted to the forefront of cold case DNA analysis. Funding for cold case units surged in the wake of stunning breakthroughs like Sarah's case. This surge in funding meant that countless other cases just like Sarah's could finally get a second look. Drop a comment below and let me know what case you want me to dive into next, because every single victim deserves to have their story told. The shockwaves from Sarah Mitchell's case were felt far beyond the walls of police stations and forensic labs. The years stretching between a murder and a resolution are an unimaginable hell for the families left behind. Now you can find advocacy groups in many states dedicated solely to the families of cold case victims. The case also triggered crucial legal reforms, including stricter evidence retention policies. Some states even enacted laws mandating periodic reviews of cold cases, guaranteeing they wouldn't just gather dust on a forgotten shelf. The power of the media in breathing life into cold cases also came into sharp focus. Keeping their name out there is everything, a family member insisted. When a case is forgotten, it stays unsolved. But when people are talking, when they remember the victim, when the public cares, it puts the pressure on. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, because we're about to break down the critical lessons we can all take away from Sarah's case. The lessons learned from Sarah Mitchell's murder go far beyond the justice system. You have to trust your gut. If someone gives you a bad feeling, even if it's someone you know, someone everyone thinks is great, listen to that little voice. Always be aware of your surroundings. Understand who's in your orbit, who has access to your home, and who knows your daily patterns. Always let someone know your plans. Sarah wasn't found for 48 agonizing hours because nobody knew to be worried right away. Real friends and good neighbors don't make you feel on edge. If their behavior seems off, if their help feels like it has conditions, or if they're a little too curious about your private life, those are giant red flags. It is always okay to say no, even to people you know well. Now, none of this is meant to sound preachy, or to imply Sarah was at fault. She absolutely was not. For parents trying to teach their kids about safety, Sarah's case provides a vital lesson. Share this video with someone who's fascinated by true crime, because the lessons from these stories are just as important as the final verdict. The community where Sarah lived took away its own hard lessons. Neighborhood watch groups that had long been inactive suddenly sprang to life in the aftermath of Sarah's murder. The factory where Sarah worked completely overhauled its security protocols after her death. Sarah's co-workers also started looking out for one another more consciously. For the wider true crime community, Sarah's case served as a powerful reminder to always respect the victims and their families. Michael Douglas's conviction also drove home the chilling reality that killers are not always the monsters you see in movies. The justice system itself learned from Sarah's case. The call to wait for stronger evidence back in 1988 was ultimately proven right, but it also cast a harsh light on the forensic limitations of that era. This breakthrough sent shockwaves through the system, sparking a massive investment in forensic research. Government grants, private funding, university programs, all of it were suddenly laser-focused on one goal, advancing the science, so no family would ever have to wait decades for answers again. The very technology that brought Sarah's case to a close in 2024 may have taken years to perfect, but it promises to solve the cases of tomorrow in a fraction of the time. Drop a comment below if you remember hearing about this case, because once Michael Douglas was convicted, Sarah Mitchell's story exploded, reaching far beyond the borders of Ohio. As we wrap up Sarah Mitchell's story, it's crucial to understand what this case truly stands for. It's about a life stolen by an act of pure, senseless violence. It's about a family whose love was stronger than decades of heartbreak. It's about detectives who guarded not just evidence, but hope itself when all seemed lost. And it's about the brilliant minds in forensics who pushed the boundaries of science until justice was no longer a dream, but a reality. But above all else, this case is a testament to one unshakable truth. There is no statute of limitations on murder. No matter how many years tick by, no matter how cold the trail becomes, the embers of hope for a resolution never truly die. Michael Douglas was convinced he'd gotten away with it. He walked free for 36 years, likely certain his dark past was buried forever. He couldn't have been more wrong. Sarah Mitchell's legacy is a complex one, etched into the hearts of many. To her family and friends, she'll always be the kind, hard-working woman who was robbed of the life she deserved. To her community, she's the woman whose tragic death became a wake-up call, forever changing the way they looked out for one another. And in the halls of justice, her name is synonymous with the case that proved persistence and technology could conquer the seemingly impossible. For every family out there living with the nightmare of an unsolved case, Sarah's story is a beacon of hope. If justice could find its way after 36 long years, then it can find its way to you too. The very science that cracked this case is constantly evolving, growing more powerful by the day. It means the evidence gathered today holds even more promise for tomorrow, and killers who believe they're safe in the shadows will one day find that technology has finally caught up to their lies. For law enforcement, this case serves as a powerful reminder: never give up on a cold case. Preserve every shred of evidence with painstaking care, because you never know when a new technology will emerge. The detectives back in 1988 had no way of imagining the DNA tools of the future, but their decision to protect that evidence was the single most important step in making this justice possible. And for the forensic scientists, Sarah's case is the ultimate validation of their tireless work. Every breakthrough in DNA analysis or every new technique, every refined protocol, it all leads to this delivering answers to families who have none. The brilliant scientists who pioneered the methods that cornered Michael Douglas may have never known Sarah, but their work became her voice, honoring her memory, and finally giving her family peace. If you're as captivated by these cases as I am, drop a 1 in the comments, because these are the stories that must be told, so they are never forgotten, and so we can learn from them. Justice is rarely a straight line. Sometimes it's a lightning strike, swift and immediate. But other times, like in Sarah's case, it's a slow, grinding journey that demands decades of patience and incredible leaps in science. Yet no matter when it arrives, its importance is absolute. It matters to the families left adrift in a sea of questions. It matters to the communities scarred by the crime. And it matters to all of us as a society because it reaffirms that every life has value, and taking one will always have a reckoning. Today, Michael Douglas is right where he belongs, behind bars, serving a life sentence without parole. One has to wonder if he's capable of reflecting on the choices that led him here. On that cold December night in 1988, he extinguished a life confident he would never be caught. And for 36 years, it looked like he was right. But the past has a long reach, and justice finally caught up, just as it does for so many who believe they can outsmart it. Back in Ohio, Sarah's grave is never lonely. It's visited by the family who never forgot the co-workers, who still recall her gentle nature, and the community that wishes to honor her. Her headstone bears the dates of her life, 1930 to 1988. A life cut brutally short. But now, an invisible line has been added to that stone, one that reads, "Justice served 2024. It was a lifetime in coming, but it came. The story of Sarah Mitchell and the man who took her life will echo for years to come. It will be studied in criminal justice classrooms, featured in cold case documentaries, and cited as a landmark in forensic science. In every telling, Sarah's memory is honored, and a powerful message is sent no matter how much time goes by. Justice is always within reach. As we bring this story to a close, let's remember Sarah Mitchell, not for how she died, but for how she lived. A woman who worked hard, cherished a simple life, and earned every moment of peace she had. Let's remember her family, who endured 36 years of not knowing, but never lost faith. And let's remember that while evil may have its moment, the truth has a way of clawing its way back into the light. If there's anyone watching who is living through the agony of an unsolved case, let Sarah's story be a source of strength for you. Never stop pushing, never stop asking questions, and never let your loved one's case go cold. Stay on the investigators, inquire about new technologies, and keep the story alive in the public eye. Justice delayed is an excruciating pain, but it is infinitely better than justice denied. In your own life, always trust your gut. Be aware of who is in your orbit, who knows your schedule, who has access to your home. This isn't about living in fear. It's about being smart. Watch out for your neighbors, and let them watch out for you. Sarah's story is a chilling reminder that danger can be closer than we think, but it also shows that a connected, vigilant community is the best defense we have. And please support the advancement of forensic science victim advocacy groups and dedicated cold case units. These aren't just abstract concepts. They are the lifelines for real families in their darkest hours. The funding for new research is what solves cases like Sarah's. The resources for cold case detectives are what brings closure after decades. The support for victims' advocates is what helps families navigate an unimaginable trauma. Let me know in the comments what state you're watching from, because the sad truth is that cases like this happen everywhere, and every single community deserves to see justice done. In the end, Sarah Mitchell's story closes with justice served, a family finally able to breathe, and a killer locked away for good. It was a journey of 36 years, one that relied on DNA technology that was science fiction in 1988, and it was fueled by the unwavering love of a family and the dedication of law enforcement. But it happened. Justice arrived late, but it was real, and that is the ultimate message of this story. Never surrender hope, never stop seeking answers, and never give up the fight for justice. Technology marches forward, old files are dusted off, and new light can be shed on the darkest of secrets. What feels like an impossible wall today can become a doorway tomorrow. What looks like the end of the line might just be a pause in the journey. Cold cases aren't hopeless. They are simply waiting for that perfect storm of evidence, technology, and unwavering determination. Michael Douglas will spend the rest of his days in a prison cell paying the price he earned. Sarah Mitchell can finally rest her name cleared and her murder avenged. Her family will now move forward, carrying a grief that never truly fades, but also the profound relief that justice has been done. And the community will remember and learn and honor her life. And right now, somewhere out there, a detective is pulling a dusty box off a shelf, opening a file that's decades old, and wondering if today's technology can unlock the secrets hidden inside. Because of cases like Sarah's, that detective isn't just hoping, they know it's possible. They know that persistence is everything, and they know that justice can find its way even across an ocean of time. If you're still here with me, thank you for taking the time to hear Sarah Mitchell's story. Thank you for seeing the person she was, not just the crime that was committed against her. Thank you for recognizing that behind every cold case file is a family frozen in time waiting. And thank you for believing that justice is always worth the wait. For more true crime stories that truly matter, go ahead and smash that subscribe button. Hit the like button if Sarah's story resonated with you, and share this with anyone who understands that these cases are about real people, real families, and the real fight for justice. And be sure to drop a comment letting me know what case you'd like me to cover next, because there are thousands of stories like Sarah's waiting to be told. Sarah Mitchell, 1930 to 1988. A life taken, but a memory never forgotten. A case delayed, but a justice finally delivered. Her legacy will now live on in the relentless pursuit of truth, in the incredible power of science, and in the unyielding love of a family who refused to let her be forgotten. Rest in peace, Sarah. Your story is now told, your justice is won, and your memory will inspire the fight for answers for years to come. Michael Douglas, born 1962. A convicted murderer now serving life without parole. His story is a stark reminder that you can't outrun your past, that science will eventually catch up to evil, and that justice never expires. The 36 years of freedom he stole are over. His future is now confined to the four walls of a prison cell, which is exactly as it should be. This is the incredible power of persistence. This is the profound promise of forensic science. And this is the hope that can be offered to every family still waiting in the dark. Justice can prevail even after decades. Cold cases can be cracked. Killers can be held accountable, and families can finally get the closure they so desperately deserve. Thank you for joining me for the story of Sarah Mitchell and the 36-year fight for justice. Don't forget to drop a comment, hit that subscribe button, and smash the like button on your way out. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay safe, stay aware, and always believe that justice will find a way.